There is something fascinating about watching Taylor Swift in an interview. Not on a massive stadium stage. Not surrounded by thousands of fans. Not behind a carefully produced music video. Just sitting on a couch, answering questions, laughing at herself, telling stories about her family, her cats, her music, and the strange reality of being one of the most recognizable people on the planet. Because when you look back at some of Taylor's most memorable interviews, you can actually watch her evolution happening in real time. You can see the teenager who was once performing at tiny events. You can see the young artist trying to figure out how much of herself she wanted the public to know. You can see the superstar learning how to deal with gossip. And eventually, you can see a woman who understood that she didn't have to explain every part of her life anymore. That evolution is what makes these interviews so interesting. Because beneath the jokes, the laughter, the celebrity stories, and the ridiculous moments, there is a much bigger Taylor Swift story. A story about independence. A story about ownership. A story about fame. And, perhaps most importantly, a story about learning how to protect yourself while still staying connected to the people who made everything possible. And that's exactly what we're going to explore today. Welcome back to Taylor Timeline, where we don't just follow the headlines. We look at the moments that reveal how Taylor Swift became Taylor Swift. And this story begins much earlier than most people realize. Long before sold-out stadiums. Long before reputation. Long before midnights. There was a 14-year-old Taylor Swift standing in front of a surprisingly small crowd at an event that sounds almost impossible compared with the scale of her career today. The Nashville Rubber Duck Race. Yes, a rubber duck race. Taylor remembered the event during one of these interviews, and the footage tells us something important. She was already performing. Already dreaming. Already putting herself out there. But she was nowhere near the superstar the world would eventually know. The event was exactly what the name suggested. Rubber ducks were placed into a river, and people watched to see which one would win. And Taylor was there as the entertainment. The contrast is almost surreal. Today, Taylor can walk onto a stage in front of tens of thousands of people and command the entire room. But at 14, the audience at this particular event was small enough that the joke almost wrote itself. Even Taylor herself seemed amused looking back at it. There was a banner. There was the race. And there was a teenage girl who had no idea just how far she was going to go. That's one of the most compelling things about archival Taylor moments. You know the ending. You know she becomes a global superstar. But she didn't. She was simply a young musician trying to get noticed. And that makes the early footage strangely emotional. Because every enormous career begins somewhere ordinary. Sometimes it begins in a tiny room. Sometimes at a local event. Sometimes in front of a crowd that has no idea they're watching somebody who will eventually change pop culture. And Taylor's early journey was full of those moments. She had to perform. She had to write. She had to audition. She had to introduce herself to people. And she had to keep going when there was no guarantee that any of it would work. That brings us to another fascinating part of the story. Taylor wasn't the only person who once had an unconventional beginning. During one interview, actor Eddie Redmayne revealed that he had also been part of a band when he was younger. The name? Blue Tonic. And yes, the conversation immediately became hilarious. Eddie admitted that he had spent years trying to bury the evidence. The band apparently never became a major success. In fact, according to his own story, they didn't really perform many gigs at all. But that tiny story creates a funny connection between two people whose careers eventually went in completely different directions. Taylor became one of the world's biggest recording artists. Eddie became an Oscar-winning actor. But before any of that, both were young people experimenting with performance and trying to figure out what they could become. That's the part of celebrity stories we often forget. The finished product is visible. The beginning usually isn't. And Taylor's beginning was much more humble than the image of global superstardom might suggest. But then something changed. The small performances became bigger. The songwriting became more confident. The audience grew. And eventually, Taylor was no longer just the young country artist people were discovering. She was becoming an international star. And that created a completely different problem. Fame. Because becoming famous is one thing. Learning how to live with fame is something else entirely. One of the most revealing parts of Taylor's interviews is how openly she has discussed the relationship between fame and privacy. During the 1989 era, she explained something that would become increasingly important throughout her career. Her life was busy, complicated, and when she allowed another person into that already chaotic environment, the public conversation could become even more complicated. The problem wasn't simply dating. It was what happened after people found out. Taylor explained the mathematics of celebrity gossip in a way that was both funny and brutally simple. If you give people one thing to talk about, they can multiply it into 50 stories. But if you give people nothing, there is nothing to multiply. 0 times anything is still 0. It was funny. But underneath the joke was something much more serious. Taylor had learned that her personal life could become public property almost instantly. A relationship wasn't simply a relationship anymore. It could become a headline. A photograph could become a theory. A rumor could become a national conversation. And suddenly, something that was supposed to belong to 2 people could become entertainment for millions. That realization helps explain why the 1989 era represented such a major shift. Taylor wasn't simply changing her sound. She was changing the way she presented herself. The country pop image was fading. The New York chapter was beginning. The friendships were becoming part of her public identity. The music was becoming brighter. And the emotional center of her songwriting was changing. She described the period as being about independence, freedom, friendship, and figuring out who she was. That is an important distinction. Taylor had spent years being known partly through heartbreak. The public had become accustomed to the idea that every new relationship might eventually become a song. But now she was pushing against that expectation. She wasn't saying emotions had disappeared. Quite the opposite. She was saying that emotional complexity didn't have to mean devastation. That distinction became central to 1989. And then came the song that turned that idea into an anthem. Shake It Off. The song wasn't simply about ignoring criticism. Taylor explained that it came from understanding that gossip wasn't something only celebrities experienced. Her fans dealt with judgment too. Ordinary people dealt with it. People were criticized at school, at work, online, in relationships, everywhere. So instead of making another song about being destroyed by what people said, Taylor wanted to make something stronger. Something playful. Something that moved. Something that basically said, "You don't get to control me." And that is why the song became so much bigger than a celebrity response. It became a philosophy. You can't stop people from talking. You can't control every headline. You can't control every rumor. But you can control how much power you give those things. And Taylor was learning exactly that. But perhaps the most interesting thing about this era wasn't what she said about gossip. It was what she did with her fans. Because while Taylor was becoming increasingly careful about her private life, she was simultaneously finding new ways to become incredibly personal with the people who supported her. And that sounds contradictory. How can someone become more private and more connected at the same time? Taylor found an answer. She invited fans into her homes. Imagine being a Taylor Swift fan in 2014. You have listened to her music for years. You've attended shows. Maybe you've waited outside venues. Maybe you've followed her online. Maybe you've never met her. And then one day, you discover that Taylor Swift has personally invited you to her house. Not to a concert. Not to a public appearance. To her home. And she's going to play an unreleased album for you. That was the basic idea behind the 1989 Secret Sessions. Taylor wanted fans to hear the album before everyone else. But she didn't simply invite celebrities. She wanted people who had supported her for years without ever getting the chance to meet her. She searched through fans' social media accounts. She looked at Instagram, Tumblr, Twitter. She watched what they posted. She followed their stories. And according to her account, she would sometimes observe them over long periods before inviting them. From Taylor's perspective, it was a way to personally thank people who had been incredibly loyal. From the fans' perspective, it was basically an emotional survival test. The stories they later posted were hilarious. One fan described waiting in the living room and being overwhelmed by anticipation. Another described Taylor appearing suddenly and the emotional reaction being so intense that the fan joked about needing an ambulance. Another fan talked about eating treats while essentially believing they had already died from excitement. And then there was the recurring language. I died. I'm dead. Rest in peace. My funeral. Taylor found the entire thing hilarious. And honestly, who could blame her? There was something incredibly funny about watching fans try to describe an experience they couldn't emotionally process. But there was also something genuinely meaningful underneath the comedy. Taylor had created an environment where fans weren't simply spectators. For a few hours, they were guests. They could hear the music before the rest of the world. They could eat cookies. They could talk to Taylor. They could meet her family. They could experience something that would never feel like an ordinary meet and greet. And this tells us something important about Taylor's relationship with her audience. Her fans weren't just consumers of her music. They were part of the story. That connection would become one of the defining features of Taylor's career. But there was another reason these secret sessions were important. They showed the difference between Taylor's public image and her private interactions with fans. The superstar on stage could seem untouchable, but the Taylor described by fans was often funny, warm, casual, and surprisingly normal. And Taylor seemed to genuinely enjoy watching their reactions. She wasn't simply promoting an album. She was creating memories. That same connection appeared in another unforgettable story involving Prince William. It happened at Kensington Palace. Taylor was there with John Bon Jovi, and at some point, Bon Jovi began singing "Livin' on a Prayer." Prince William was encouraged to join, and then he turned to Taylor and encouraged her to come with him. Taylor described the moment as surreal. She was standing with a future King of England, being pulled onto a stage to sing along to a classic rock song. For someone who had spent years being watched by the world, it was still possible for Taylor to find herself in a moment where she was the one completely overwhelmed. And the photographs from that night became part of the story. Taylor joked about Prince William looking like a fan. The future king appeared to be enjoying himself. And once again, Taylor's reaction wasn't that of someone who had become completely numb to celebrity. She was still capable of being surprised. Still capable of being nervous. Still capable of thinking, how is this actually happening? That human quality is one reason her interviews work so well. Even when the circumstances are extraordinary, Taylor often tells the story in a way that makes it feel relatable. But if you want to understand another side of Taylor's personality, you have to meet one of the most important characters in her story. Her mother, Andrea Swift. Taylor has joked about her mother being a worrier. A serious worrier. Taylor even gave her a nickname, Worst Case Scenario Andrea. The description was affectionate, but the stories were incredible. According to Taylor, her mother could somehow imagine the most unlikely disaster in almost any situation. Candles. Potential fire hazard. News story. Potential medical danger. Internet. Potential intelligence database. Taylor joked that Andrea couldn't always figure out how to use a phone, yet somehow managed to uncover enormous amounts of information online. It was classic mother behavior. And it revealed something that doesn't always come through in Taylor's glamorous public image. Her family still worries about her. They still tease her. They still embarrass her. They still act like she's their daughter rather than one of the biggest stars on earth. And that is important, because fame can distort everything. But family has a way of pulling someone back toward normal life. Taylor could walk onto a stage in front of tens of thousands of people. She could dominate a chart. She could make global headlines. And then she could go home and have her mother warn her that the candles might cause lung problems. That contrast is funny, but it's also grounding. And Taylor has often spoken about the importance of her family throughout her journey. Her mother's influence wasn't just about worrying. It was also about support. And that support mattered because Taylor's career came with an enormous amount of pressure. The more famous she became, the more scrutiny followed. Every outfit could be analyzed. Every relationship could become a story. Every lyric could be investigated. Every facial expression could become evidence in some fan theory. And eventually, Taylor had to learn that she couldn't answer all of it. She couldn't correct every rumor. She couldn't explain every misunderstanding. She couldn't make everyone see her the way she saw herself. So she began to focus on something else. The work, the music, the fans, and the things she could control. That philosophy would become even more important during the years surrounding Reputation. Because Taylor stepped away from interviews for a significant period. She became much quieter. And when she eventually returned, the absence itself had become part of the story. For a celebrity who had once been everywhere, Taylor's decision to disappear from interviews was striking. She explained that during the Reputation era, she deliberately kept a low profile. There was even a rhyme she used to describe the approach. There would be no explanation. There would just be reputation. It was clever. It rhymed. And it fit the era perfectly. But it also represented a major evolution. Earlier Taylor had been willing to explain. Now she was more comfortable letting people wonder. That is a huge difference. Because sometimes privacy isn't about having something to hide. Sometimes privacy is simply refusing to turn every part of your life into public content. Taylor had learned that lesson through experience. And when she eventually returned to interviews, there was something noticeably different. She was still funny. Still conversational. Still willing to tell embarrassing stories. But there were boundaries. She could laugh about the public conversation without surrendering her entire private life. That balance would become increasingly important as her fame grew. And then there was another chapter that showed just how seriously Taylor took her creative development. Film. Specifically, All Too Well. When Red was released in 2012, All Too Well wasn't initially treated like the cultural phenomenon it would eventually become. It wasn't released as a major single. But fans loved it. And Taylor had once revealed that the song had originally been much longer. Around 10 minutes. There were additional verses. More details. More story. And fans wouldn't let the idea disappear. They kept asking about the 10-minute version. Years passed. Taylor's career evolved. And then came the re-recording project. Taylor decided to release the longer version. But she didn't stop there. She wanted to turn the story into something visual. A short film. Not simply a traditional music video. A narrative project. And that decision was important because it revealed another side of Taylor's artistic development. She wasn't just writing songs anymore. She was thinking about storytelling through multiple forms. She was directing, writing, casting, building scenes, working with actors, and trying to create something that could stand on its own. The result became one of the most talked about creative extensions of her music. Taylor worked with Sadie Sink and Dylan O'Brien to portray the young couple at the center of the story. And she explained that the dialogue was scripted, but she also liked giving actors opportunities to experiment. That is a small detail, but it says a lot. Taylor wasn't simply interested in controlling every second. She wanted collaboration. She wanted to learn. She wanted to grow. And when Eddie Redmayne heard Taylor talk about directing, he recognized exactly what that meant from an actor's perspective. A director telling actors, "We've done the scripted version. Now try it your way." That kind of trust can be incredibly valuable. And Taylor seemed to understand that. She described directing as something she wanted to continue exploring. A natural extension of her storytelling. And that brings us to another fascinating part of her evolution. Taylor was no longer simply revisiting old songs. She was reclaiming them. One of the biggest developments in Taylor's career was her decision to re-record her early albums. The reason was deeply personal. Taylor explained that she had wanted to own the work from her first 6 albums. When the ownership situation changed and those masters were sold, she decided to create a different path. If she had made those songs once, she could make them again. That sentence contains the entire philosophy. Instead of simply accepting the situation, Taylor created a new project. She went back through her catalog. She revisited old songs. She re-recorded them. And then something happened that she couldn't completely control. Fans embraced the new versions. Radio stations began supporting them. The new recordings became more than replacements. They became statements. They represented ownership, agency, and the idea that an artist could revisit her own history on her own terms. Taylor admitted that the project was incredibly meaningful to her, but she hadn't necessarily expected everyone else to care. Then fans did. They cared enormously. And that support mattered. Because suddenly, the old music wasn't just old music anymore. It was part of a new chapter. Taylor was taking pieces of her own history and bringing them forward. And nowhere was that more emotionally powerful than with All Too Well. The 10-minute version wasn't simply a longer song. For many fans, it felt like a piece of Taylor's history that had finally been allowed to exist in the form she originally imagined. And then Taylor turned it into a film, which brought together songwriting, acting, directing, and visual storytelling. That evolution didn't happen overnight. It was built across years of experimentation. And there is perhaps no better example of Taylor's willingness to experiment than the story of Cats. Yes. Cats School. Taylor's involvement in the film adaptation of Cats sounded almost perfectly designed for someone who already had cats at home. Her character was Bombalurina. And because the performers needed to understand feline movement and behavior, Taylor went through training. She joked about it. But the process was serious. She studied cats. She watched videos. She learned about their physical behavior. She crawled around. And what was supposed to be a short period of training eventually became months. For Taylor, it was apparently one of the most entertaining experiences imaginable. And if you know anything about her relationship with her own cats, the story makes even more sense. Taylor's. So let's go back to that 14-year-old girl. The one standing at a rubber duck race in Nashville. At the time, nobody looking at that stage could have known what was coming. There was no guarantee she would become a superstar. No guarantee she would win awards. No guarantee she would sell millions of albums. No guarantee she would eventually perform for enormous stadium audiences. She was just a young musician. But she kept showing up. She kept writing. She kept performing. She kept learning. And years later, she was sitting on television couches telling stories about the journey. Stories about embarrassing auditions. Stories about cats. Stories about her mother. Stories about fans. Stories about Prince William. Stories about accidents during a Rolling Stone interview. Stories about brown teeth during an audition. Stories about directing. Stories about ownership. Stories about sleepless nights. And somehow, all of those stories connect. Because this isn't really a story about one interview. It's a story about evolution. It's about what happens when an artist grows up in public. And Taylor had to do that in a way very few people ever have. Millions of people watched. Millions of people judged. Millions of people celebrated. And millions of people became emotionally attached to the soundtrack of their own lives through her music. That's an enormous burden. But it's also an extraordinary connection. And maybe that's why the funniest moments in these interviews can sometimes be just as revealing as the serious ones. Because underneath the superstar is still someone who can laugh at herself. Someone who can talk about her mother embarrassing her. Someone who can joke about her cats. Someone who can tell a story about nearly crashing a car during a major magazine interview. Someone who can remember being 14 and performing at an event involving rubber ducks. The scale changed. The person kept growing. And the story is still being written. That's what makes the Taylor Swift timeline so fascinating. Not because every era is perfect. Not because every decision is universally understood. But because every chapter adds something. And when you look back, you realize that the journey was never simply from famous to more famous. It was from young artist to songwriter. From songwriter to performer. From performer to superstar. From superstar to businesswoman and owner. From musician to director. From celebrity to cultural phenomenon. And through all of it, Taylor continued doing the one thing she had been doing since she was that teenager with a guitar, telling stories. So perhaps the biggest takeaway from these interviews isn't the jokes, the celebrity encounters, the cats, the secret sessions, or even the albums. It's the evolution behind them. Because the Taylor Swift story has never really been about becoming someone else. It has been about becoming more fully herself. And for the fans who have been there through every era, every haircut, every album, every controversy, Every comeback and every unforgettable moment, that's the part that matters most. The girl from those early performances didn't know where the road would lead. But she kept walking. And now, years later, millions of people are still walking with her. That's the real story. And whatever the next era brings, one thing is almost certain: Swifties will be watching. And here at Taylor Timeline, we'll be right there following every chapter. If you've been part of Taylor's journey for years, or you're just discovering the deeper stories behind the music, make sure you subscribe and stay with us. Because the timeline doesn't end here. The next era is always waiting.